Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we're going to be going through the discography of one of my all-time favorite songwriters, Brian Wilson. And I've already done a Beach Boys tier list a few years ago, and initially when I started this channel, the majority of the content that I was putting out at the beginning was all Beach Boys related stuff. So this video is very long overdue. But I did need to spend a little bit more time with some of these albums to really solidify my thoughts, because I do listen to the Beach Boys catalog a lot more than I listen to Brian Wilson's solo stuff, but I'm glad to have finally gotten around to putting this video together. And what I'm going to do is go through his 11 studio albums, going from his self-titled album up to At My Piano, and I will also be including his unreleased album Sweet Insanity, as well as his compilation album Orange Crate Art with Van Dyke Parks, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 13 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have his debut self-titled studio album from 1988 titled Brian Wilson, and I will give this one an S. This is a very good album. It's not without its flaws. I do have a couple of issues with it, but I do think the majority of this album is excellent. I will say that for me personally, sometimes I do have a hard time listening to this period of Brian Wilson's music, because he was under the supervision of Eugene Landy at this time, and that whole period was just so dark and sad for Brian, as I'm sure everybody listening to this is well aware of. And sometimes for me, it's hard to listen to this music and separate it from the very bad circumstances that Brian was under when this album was getting made. And I feel like you could hear it in his voice throughout a lot of these songs. It's very clearly not the Brian Wilson from the 60s and 70s. And I feel like you can hear some of the tension and anxiety in his voice throughout some of these songs. And when I hear that, my heart just breaks for Brian when I think about it, because he's such a sweet and gentle soul, and Eugene Landy really did some horrendous things to him during this period. And Landy had also contributed writing and production on this album, but a lot of it has been disputed over the years as to what he did contribute to. And I do think that Eugene Landy having any involvement with Brian's creative process is only a detriment, and that is definitely one of the reasons as to why I wouldn't say that this is a perfect album. But also on the flip side of that, we do have some co-production and contributions from other people that I think are very good with Brian, like Jeff Lynne and Andy Paley. And I will say I'm not a huge fan of the production on this album. It very much sounds like an 80s record. It's very synth heavy and definitely has some cheesy sounding moments to my ears. And I'm sure after everything I'm saying right now, people are wondering why I put this in S tier, because I do have some critiques of this album. But beyond some of those issues that I just laid out, I do think that the actual songs on here are very strong. It's got 11 tracks, and I do think the overwhelming majority of the songs on here are very good and do contain all of those elements that I love about Brian Wilson's writing, with his beautiful sense of melody and his colorful and unexpected chord changes. For side one, we have 7 tracks, and of the 7 songs on here, I really enjoy every song with the exception of Little Children. I think that's a pretty weak throwaway track that didn't necessarily need to be on this album, but there are definitely some standout moments for me as well, with tracks like Love and Mercy, Walkin' the Line, Melt Away, There's So Many, and One for the Boys, which gives us those classic Beach Boys style vocal harmonies. Side 2 then has another 4 tracks, with my 2 favorites being Let It Shine and Meet Me in My Dreams Tonight, which gives us some great writing collaborations with Jeff Lynne and Andy Paley. And the only track I'm not crazy about on side 2 is Nighttime, but other than that and Little Children, I think all of the other songs on this album are very good. And like I said, I'm not always crazy about the production. The circumstances under which this album was made with Eugene Landy provides kind of this darkness that surrounds this record. But if I look past those things, I think at the end of the day, these are still great pop songs that have all of those classic Brian Wilson flavors in them. And with Brian being one of my favorite songwriters of all time, I can never resist a good Brian Wilson pop song, and I think this album certainly delivers on that front. So a very good first album with a lot of standout tracks. I will give this one an S. Okay, next we have an unreleased album that was recorded between 1986 and 1990, and this was intended as a follow-up to his debut album, and this one is titled Sweet Insanity, and this one is not officially considered a Brian Wilson studio album, but I do think it is a piece of work that is worth listening to and discussing, and you can find this entire album on YouTube, so it's one of those unreleased albums that we still have access to and should listen to, and this is another album where Eugene Landy had some involvement in it. And like I said about the first release, I do sometimes have a hard time listening to records from this period, knowing what was going on, and ultimately Gene Landy's lyrics were one of the reasons why this record was rejected from the label. Now, as far as what I think about this album, I'm going to give it a B. I think that this album has some good stuff in it, but it definitely has a couple of weird moments that do take away from it a bit for me. And critiquing Brian for these weird moments, I think, is unfair because you really have no idea what was going on behind the scenes and how much input Brian actually had on these records. But similar to what I said with the first album, if I can look past those things and just try to listen to it from a music perspective, there are definitely plenty of Brian Wilson moments throughout this one as well. The original track listing consisted of 11 songs, and we do get a couple of guest features on here as well with Bob Dylan and Jeff Lynne. And I do think that side one is the stronger half of the album. I'm not the biggest fan of Someone to Love, but other than that, I think the other 4 tracks are strong. I think track 6, which is titled Brian, is an exceptionally beautiful song. That would make my top 5 favorite Brian Wilson songs. That is definitely the high point of this album for me. But side 2 is where it starts to lose me a little bit, and it gets a little weirder and is ultimately why I put it in B tier. I'm actually not the biggest fan of the Bob Dylan and Jeff Lynne feature track, which is titled The Spirit of Rock and Roll. Just never really did anything for me for some reason. And Love You I find to be pretty bland and uninteresting. And then Smart Girls is a very bizarre song to close on. I have a really hard time listening to it. It's this really weird rap song, and it just sounds like a track that Brian really did not want to do. And I know Brian would go on to say that they were kidding around and having fun with this track, but in the moment, I really don't know if this was something that Brian wanted to do. And for me, I just have a hard time listening to it. It's one of the big things that affects this album and turns it off for me. And also another reason why the album was rejected by the record label was because of this track. I will say, though, that Rainbow Eyes and Make-A-Wish I think are both fine songs, and I'm glad that a couple of these tracks would later go on to be recorded for the Gettin' In Over My Head album, and I think he did a good job of picking the stronger songs from this album to re-record them for that album, with the one exception being Brian. I wish he had also included that because I would have loved to hear a re-recording of that song because, like I said, I think that song is absolutely incredible and would be the biggest thing that I would say in favor of this album. So I would say it's a bit of a downgrade from the self-titled album, but it's not without some strong moments as well. But I do think this album is kind of all over the place and not as consistent as the self-titled album, and side 2 is really where it starts to die down for me. But regardless of that, it still has some great moments in the midst of that, so an okay album, but I wouldn't say it's great. I will give this one a B. Okay, next we have his second studio album from 1995 titled I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. This is a soundtrack album for a documentary of the same name, which was centered around Brian Wilson, and I'm going to give this one a B. I have weird thoughts about this album because it's almost entirely re-recordings of older Beach Boys songs and a couple of recordings of tracks from Brian Wilson's first solo album as well. And I understand the reasoning for remaking these songs for the documentary, but if I'm just listening to them objectively without the documentary in mind, I do prefer the original recordings for almost every song on this album, with the 2 exceptions being the tracks from Brian Wilson's first album, which are Love and Mercy and Melt Away. I actually do like the versions on this album more. I tend to prefer the more stripped down, less overly produced versions of those songs as opposed to the original versions from that first album, and the acoustic guitar on Love and Mercy adds some really nice sweetness to it. The other standout moment for this album for me is the home demo of the song Still I Dream of It. I absolutely love this song, and the rawness of the recording and Brian's more raspy, later 70s voice singing it almost creates this haunting sort of effect that I really love, and I feel like I'm just sitting in the room with Brian hearing him play that song. And for me, those 3 tracks would really be the standout moments of the album, and it's weird because every other song on here are great songs on their own, and I wouldn't say I dislike any of them. them. It's just more of the fact that if I had to choose between these versions and the original Beach Boys recordings, I would go with the originals almost all of the time. So it's kind of a weird album and a hard one to score because it doesn't really have any songs that I dislike. It's just more of a preference of which versions of the recordings I would like to listen to. So ultimately, it felt right to put this one in B tier. Okay, next we have a compilation album between Brian Wilson and Van Dyke Parks titled Orange Crate Art, and I will give this one an S. I absolutely love this album. I feel like it's pretty underrated. It doesn't get the praise that I think it deserves, and I'm not really sure why, because I think the pairing of Brian Wilson and Van Dyke Parks is magical, and this is their first collaboration since the Smile album, and this record is really more of a Van Dyke Parks album in the sense that he wrote all of the songs and Brian is only contributing vocals and vocal arrangements, but I think that this album is well worth checking out, and it should not be overlooked amongst Brian Wilson fans because I do think that Van Dyke Parks is another very gifted and truly unique songwriter that shares a lot of similar sensibilities to Brian and is one of the reasons why I think that they worked so well together. This album has 12 tracks, and compositionally, Van Dyke Parks is delivering some very high-quality songs, and I think Brian's vocals work really well for this setting. There are certain songs that I like more than others, but I wouldn't say that this album has any songs that I dislike. I think they are all very unique and intriguing in their own ways. My personal favorites would be Sail Away, My Hobo Heart, Wings of a Dove, Hold Back Time, and My Janine. I also think the production from Van Dyke Parks is very strong on this, and I've always wished that they would have done another collaboration album together, especially one where Brian would have contributed songwriting as well, because, like I said, I think they both have so much unique things to offer from a songwriting perspective, and the Smile album is a very clear example of what kind of stuff they can achieve when they put their creative forces together, and I think they complement each other very nicely. But even though Brian didn't contribute songwriting on this one, I do really appreciate this record for what it is, and I think it was really solid of Van Dyke Parks to approach Brian Wilson at this time in his life as he was going through a court-ordered restraining order from Eugene Landy, and I think getting him involved in a project like this was very good for him at that time in his life, and I think it came out very well. And who knows if the Smile album ever would have came to fruition if Van Dyke Parks had not approached Brian about this one, because this was the initial, rekindling of their friendship that ultimately led to more things years down the road. So I think this album is very important from a historical perspective of Brian Wilson's, discography, and also just a very intriguing and artistic expression from Van Dyke Parks that I think came out very, very good. So an awesome album that I really don't have anything negative to say about. This one gets an S. All right, next we have his third studio album from 1998 titled Imagination, and I will give this one an A. I think this is a very enjoyable album, and it's nice hearing these new original songs come from Brian now that he is on the other side of the Eugene Landy situation, which means that Landy has no involvement in this record, and I think it's pretty clear throughout this that when Brian is left to his own devices, a lot of magic can happen, and I think we hear that all throughout this. And I think these songs sound like the birth of a new side to Brian Wilson, which I think is a very uplifting and positive feeling all throughout this record. I will say, though, that this record is not without its flaws. It's got a couple of little things here and there that I'm not crazy about, which is ultimately why I didn't give it an S. It's got two re-recorded Beach Boys songs, which are Keep an Eye on Summer and Let 'Em Run Wild, both of which are incredible Beach Boys songs and deep cuts for the hardcore fans. And I appreciate the song choices on that front, but at the same time, I think the originals on here are so good that I don't really have a huge desire to hear Brian re-record older Beach Boys songs. I would have much rather had heard two more originals on here as opposed to those two tracks, and that's one area of this record that I'm not crazy about. But when it comes to the originals, I enjoy almost all of them. The only song I would say I dislike on here is Sunshine. That one just doesn't really resonate with me stylistically, and South American is a song that I'm sort of indifferent about. I wouldn't say I dislike it, but I'm not crazy about it either. But other than those two tracks, I think the remainder of the originals on here are very strong and very high quality Brian Wilson pop tracks. The opening two tracks in particular, Your Imagination and She Says That She Needs Me, I think are a very strong way to bring the album in, and both songs contrast each other in mood and tempo very nicely. Other favorites of mine on here would be Where Has Love Been, Dream Angel, and Lay Down Burden. The closing track, Happy Days, is fascinating too because it's got some moments that are very dark and eerie, and we know Brian has that side of him, and we hear it come out occasionally on tracks like Mrs. O'Leary's Cow. And this song doesn't stay in that dark mood forever, but it definitely has some moments that take us out into these really kind of scary territories. And I thought it was very interesting to include some moments like that on the final track of this album. It's a little unexpected for sure, but I don't have an issue with it, and I always like hearing what sorts of wild sounds Brian's able to come up with when he's channeling that mood. But all in all, regardless of the couple of minor issues I have with this, I think the majority of the songs on here are very strong, and definitely have a couple of songs that would make my list of top 10 favorite Brian Wilson tracks, with songs like Where Has Love Been and Imagination. And now knowing that he's on the other side of the Eugene Landy situation is also more promising and exciting to see this first album of originals to come out after that and show some very promising tracks that make us excited for what else Brian Wilson has to share with the world in the coming years. So a very solid album. This one will get an A. Okay, next we have his fourth studio album from 2004 titled Gettin' In Over My Head, and I would give this one a B. I think this album is okay, but definitely not amazing, and I would say it's a bit of a downgrade from Imagination. And this is an interesting record because it's a mixture of a few different things. It's got a handful of new songs written for this album, and then it has 4 older songs from the Andy Paley sessions, and 4 re-recordings of songs that were originally written for the Sweet Insanity album. And it also has a lot of guest features popping up with people like Carl Wilson, Elton John, Paul McCartney, and Eric Clapton. And I think because of the mixture of different tracks and features happening throughout this album, it kind of feels all over the place and scattered to me, and it doesn't have a very cohesive feel all the way throughout. It's very long too, at 53 minutes in length, and it's got 13 tracks, and I don't necessarily think that every single track needed to be included on here. I think it could have been trimmed down to maybe 10 songs and would have been a bit better, because there are a handful of songs on here that I do find pretty underwhelming, with a couple of them actually being the Andy Paley session tracks, with songs like Soul Searchin' and Desert Drive, as well as City Blues and the opening track, How Can We Still Be Dancin'. I remember when I first put this album on, I had very high hopes because it opened up with those a cappella vocal harmonies, and I thought it was going to be a really cool album. But then after those harmonies die down, it veers off into this rock and roll, kind of groove that sounds kind of corny to me and is a weak start to the album. But at the same time, with any Brian Wilson album, even if there are some underwhelming tracks, there's always going to be some high points, and this album certainly has a couple of those. As far as the Andy Paley session songs go, I do think that the title track, Gettin' In Over My Head, is very strong and one of the best songs on this album. And I think the 4 songs from the Sweet Insanity album are all a bit stronger as well. There's basically 3 songs on this album that I would say are incredible tracks, and those would be Gettin' In Over My Head, as well as You've Touched Me and Fairy Tale. Fairy Tale is probably my favorite song on here and would also make my list of top 10 favorite Brian Wilson songs, and You've Touched Me might make that list as well. So definitely a couple of great moments throughout this, but I do think there is a lot of fluff on this track listing and ultimately hurts the momentum of the album a little too much and goes on for a little bit too long. I would say about 8 to 9 of the 13 tracks on here are fine, and also has those 3 standout moments that I had mentioned. But altogether, I would say that this album is just okay and not great. So I will give this one a B. Alright, next we have his 5th studio album from 2004 titled Brian Wilson Presents Smile. Obviously, this one is going to get an S, probably no big surprises here. And for anybody who isn't aware, I'll give you a little brief history of this album. So the Smile album was initially intended to be the Beach Boys' follow-up album to Pet Sounds in 1967, and the album never ended up getting released due to a variety of different things, such as Brian Wilson's mental health problems, really acting up, and a lot of different legal things that were going on within the record label. And this was a very traumatic time for Brian, and he had been reluctant to revisit this album for quite some time. But over the years, and through a variety of different things that had happened, Brian would eventually decide to revisit the tracks and put on a live concert that consisted of material from Smile, and he modified some of the material with new lyrics and new melodies. And this concert would end up happening in 2004, and this was obviously obviously a huge moment for Brian and for the Smile album, and because it had such a positive reception, Brian had decided to make a studio album based on the performances that they did, and that is what this record is. This album is split up into 3 different movements, and just like how it was in 67, we've got Brian writing a lot of music with Van Dyke Parks contributing lyrics, and this is just undeniably an incredible album. And if we're looking at Brian Wilson's solo discography, I think it's pretty hard to argue that this is not him at his peak creativity. And granted, this music was written decades prior, and he had gone back, revisited it, and decided how he wanted to assemble it, but regardless of that, this album is just so good and would go down as my favorite Brian Wilson album. Movement 1 takes us through this incredible journey, opening up with the beautiful vocal harmonies of Our Prayer, and then rolling into Heroes and Villains, which is a classic hit, and then giving us more of those artistic and experimental rock songs with Roll Plymouth Rock, Barnyard, Old Master Painter, You Are My Sunshine, and then wrapping up Movement 1 with Cabinescence, which is a song that did end up getting released on the Beach Boys album 2020. Movement 2 would be my particular favorite spot of the album, with a couple of my favorite tracks popping up with Wonderful, which has an absolutely incredible and adventurous chord progression that weaves in and out of so many interesting keys. And then we have Song for Children and Child is Father of the Man, which weave into each other beautifully. And then Movement 2 concludes with Surf's Up, which is one of my all-time favorite Brian Wilson songs. And again, another one that was released on the Beach Boys album, Surf's Up. So a few of the songs on here had been used for Beach Boys albums, but were originally written and intended for the Smile album. And then Movement 3 gives us 7 more songs, starting on a more feel-good and comical vibe with I'm in Great Shape and Vegetables, and then it gets a little more experimental and xylophone-centered with On a Holiday and Wind Chimes, which are amazing pieces. And then we get what is probably Brian Wilson's most experimental and dark song, which is Mrs. O'Leary's Cow, also known as Fire. I absolutely love this song, and I think it is just the ultimate track to embody that darker side of Brian Wilson's writing, and he doesn't let it out very often, but when he does, I always think it's very effective, and I would say this is probably the most terrifying song that Brian Wilson has ever written. Then we mellow out a bit with In Blue Hawaii, and then conclude the album with the Beach Boys classic Good Vibrations, which is a perfect energetic way to wrap up this very incredible set of 3 movements. To be able to go back and revisit this and finally put it out into the world had to be such a satisfying feeling for Brian and give him such a feeling of relief, and I think he knocked it out of the park. And obviously, we also have to give thanks to Van Dyke Parks and Darian. Darian is really like the secret weapon of Brian Wilson, and every Brian Wilson fan owes a debt of gratitude to him for assisting the assemblance and release of this album. And if anybody is interested, there is a great documentary that films the making of this record. It's called Beautiful Dreamer, Brian Wilson and the Story of Smile, and you could actually watch it on YouTube, and it's a really great look at how this album came to be and the full history behind it. But yeah, I cannot say enough good things about this album. I'm so happy that it came into fruition. And like I said, this is my favorite Brian Wilson album. Probably not a huge surprise to anybody, so this one gets an easy S. Okay, moving on, we have his 6th studio album from 2005, which is a Christmas album titled What I Really Want for Christmas. And I will give this a B. I think this album is okay, but I'm not a huge fan of it. I think there are chunks of it that are underwhelming, and I'm not a huge fan of some of the song choices on here, but at the same time, it definitely has a couple of moments that I do find very enjoyable, and a couple of Christmas song choices that I do think worked really well. But as a whole, there are some dips throughout this album, and I do think, again, this one goes on for a tad too long. And I also think part of the reason why I'm kind of hard on this album is because I love the Beach Boys Christmas album so much. It's probably my number 1 favorite Christmas album of all time. And I think knowing what Brian was capable of on that album and then going into this, I think I'm just holding it to very high standards that don't match up, unfortunately. But one thing that I will say in Brian's defense is that I think he should have written a couple of more originals on here, because I actually think the 3 originals that he wrote are the high points of this album, with the tracks What I Really Want for Christmas, Christmas-y, and On Christmas Day. All 3 of those songs are absolutely beautiful and have all of those classic Brian Brian Wilson flavors with the really colorful and beautiful sense of melody and the interesting chord changes. The track Christmassy, in particular, I think is one of the most underrated Christmas songs of all time. And believe it or not, even though it's a Christmas song, it would go down in my top 5 favorite Brian Wilson song list. I just think the main melody to that song is so beautiful and would definitely be the high point of this album for me. I feel like this song deserves a lot more praise than it gets. I also would have preferred if they took out the 2 re-recorded songs from the Beach Boys Christmas album with The Man with All the Toys and Little Saint Nick. As I said on a previous album, I'm never a huge fan of the remakes whenever Brian does them. I would always prefer if he just did a couple of more originals as opposed to the remakes, and I think that also could have increased the quality of this album by a bit. And to be fair, there are a couple of Christmas song choices on here that I think are very nice, like Hark the Herald Angels Sing, The First Noel, Silent Night, and Auld Lang Syne, which was a nice nod to the Beach Boys Christmas album. A very nice ending to the original release, but I do think the bonus tracks enhance the album because you get that third original with On Christmas Day. So it does have some good moments throughout it and a couple of originals that I think are very good, but I do think it is a little long and there are a few too many underwhelming song choices that do take away from the momentum a little bit. And in comparison to the Beach Boys Christmas album, I wouldn't say that this one stands up as well. So not a great album, but not terrible either. So I will give this one a B. All right, next we have his 7th studio album from 2008 titled That Lucky Old Sun, and I will give this one an S. I absolutely love this album, and if we took Smile out of the picture and just spoke of new Brian Wilson original material, this would be my favorite album of his that consists of all new originals. I think this is his most cohesive record. It sounds very focused, and it sounds like Brian knew exactly what he was trying to achieve with this one, and it's a concept album with a very clear direction that it takes you through. Brian's production is amazing on this. I think it's his best produced album, and his voice I think sounds great as well. And in general, it just seems like this was a very positive, productive, and creative time for Brian. And I've heard some people compare this album to Smile, and I definitely see some of the similarities in it. Obviously, it sounds completely different than Smile, and they are completely different albums. And at this point in Brian's life, he's writing stuff in his later 60s, so it's going to be much different than how he was writing in his late 20s during the Smile album. But from the sense of being a record that feels like a very creative time for Brian and having him really in the driver's seat, I can definitely see the parallels between this and Smile in terms of that, and also in terms of the rich and big instrumentations that are being utilized. And like I said, this one is a concept album with the old 40s song That Lucky Old Sun kind of serving as this recurring theme throughout the album and having some narrations in between tracks. And I think almost this entire album is great. The only song that doesn't really resonate with me stylistically is Mexican Girl, but in the grand scheme of the 17 songs, it really doesn't take away from the album very much. The first half has some really big high moments with amazing originals like Forever She'll Be My Surfer Girl and Good Kind of Love. But I think the ending chunk of the album in particular is really where the magic starts happening, with 2 particular songs, Midnight's Another Day and Southern California, both of which I would say are some of the most beautiful songs Brian has ever written, and they would both easily make my list of top 10 favorite Brian Wilson songs, in addition to Forever She'll Be My Surfer Girl as well. I think that's another really big high point of this record, and that's another reason why I love this album so much. I would say of all of the Brian Wilson albums, with the exception of Smile, this one contains the largest amount of my favorite Brian Wilson songs all on one record. I think it's got some of the most exceptional songs of his discography, and I also really appreciate the inclusion of Can't Wait Too Long, which was an unfinished Beach Boys song from 1967, and I love that he included that on this, and I think it functions in a very effective spot on the album. But yeah, I think Brian knocked it out of the park with this one, and showing that even in his later 60s, he is fully capable of delivering us some really high quality and artistic pop music with a very clear direction and attention to detail that resulted in what I think is one of the best albums of his discography. So an incredible album. This one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have his 8th studio album from 2010 titled Brian Wilson Reimagines Gershwin. This is one of 2 albums that Brian would release under Walt Disney Records. He was initially approached about doing an album of his own arrangements of Disney songs, but he first wanted to record a George Gershwin tribute album, which they had agreed to, and that led to this. Now, as far as what I think about this album, I really enjoy this one. I'm going to give this one an A. I'm a big jazz fan, and obviously George Gershwin is one of the best and most influential jazz composers of all time, and he had contributed so many timeless jazz standards. And I love so much about this album. The choice in song is spot on, covering all of the classics like Summertime, It Ain't Necessarily So, They Can't Take That Away From Me, Someone to Watch Over Me. Just so many incredible standards all throughout this album, but also incorporating a few lesser known ones which are always nice to get turned on to, like The Like and I Love You and Nothing But Love, which I really appreciate. And I actually can't find any other recordings of these songs, so I'm wondering where these songs came from, because obviously they have to be George Gershwin songs if it's a tribute album, but I'm wondering if some of these songs have never been recorded by anyone else. And that was something that I learned as I was doing research for this album, so I'm curious if anybody has any more information on those 2 particular tracks. But I really love the opening segment of Rhapsody in Blue with the a cappella vocal harmonies. Incredible vocal writing, giving us those classic Brian Wilson harmonies over a very colorful jazz palette. And I love how it opens and ends the album as like the main melodic theme. Just a perfect little section of a melody to function as that. I love the orchestrations, the strings in particular on tracks like I Loves You Porgy, Love Is Here to Stay, and Someone to Watch Over Me are very beautiful. And I think Brian's singing sounds great on this. He sounds like he's really into it, and it's obviously coming from a very real and sincere place, because Brian obviously studied jazz music, and anybody who knows and appreciates jazz mutually agrees that George Gershwin is one of the greats, and I think Brian did a really good tribute to him throughout this. So a very good album. I will give this an A. All right, next we have his 9th studio album from 2011 titled In the Key of Disney. This is the 2nd album released for the Disney record label, and unfortunately, I'm going to give this one a C. I'm not the biggest fan of this album. This would go down as my least favorite Brian Wilson record, and for me, it's mostly just because of the fact that I'm not a huge fan of a lot of the song selections on here, and they aren't songs that I'm particularly interested in hearing Brian Wilson cover. There are a few tracks scattered throughout that I do find enjoyable, and I do think that Brian does some nice takes on them. The particular ones being You've Got a Friend in Me. I think that's a solid song. I have no issues with that one. I also like Baby Mine from Dumbo, and my favorite one would be We Belong Together from Toy Story 3. I think if Brian had done more Randy Newman songs, I may have liked it a bit more, because the Randy Newman choices are the high points for me, and I don't resonate as much with a lot of the other selections. But other than that, I also enjoy Stay Awake and the closer, When You Wish Upon a Star, which is obviously a very beautiful song and a classic jazz standard, so obviously that one is going to go over well with Brian, and he does some really great vocal harmonies for the beginning, which I always love to hear. I think anytime you do a tribute album, it's going to be tricky, because there is always going to be a segment of your audience that might not enjoy it, and to be fair, he took that same risk with the Reimagined Gershwin album, because not everybody is a fan of jazz, so that's not going to resonate with every single person in his fan base. It did with me, but on the flip side, I'm not a huge fan of Disney music, so this one didn't resonate with me as much. So not a great album in my opinion. I don't find myself going back and listening to this one very much, and it would go down as my least favorite Brian Wilson record. So this one gets a C. All right, next we have his 10th studio album from 2015 titled No Peer Pressure, and I will give this one a B. This is an album that I have a lot of mixed feelings about. This came out after the reunion of the Beach Boys in 2012 with the album That's Why God Made the Radio. And initially after that, Brian had intended to record more with the Beach Boys, but then decided to make a solo album instead. And this would be his first album of originals since That Lucky Old Son in 2008, because the previous 2 albums were the albums for Disney with the Gershwin and Disney tributes. And for this album, Brian had chose to do a lot lot of guest features and having a mixture of some younger musicians as well as Al Jardine and Blondie Chaplin on select songs. And I think it's cool that Brian chose to go in this direction, and I don't think there's anything wrong with doing it. But at the same time, if you're featuring a lot of different vocalists on the majority of the songs, of course, it's not going to sound like a full-blown Brian Wilson album from front to back. But even regardless of that, the music is still being written by Brian, and we still have plenty of Brian Wilson moments all throughout this. It's got 13 songs, and I do actually enjoy about 8 to 9 of the tracks on here. It definitely has a couple that don't resonate with me stylistically, with tracks like Runaway Dancer, On the Island, Half Moon Bay, Sail Away, and Saturday Night. At the same time, though, there are still some incredible tracks throughout this, with my personal favorites being Whatever Happened, Our Special Love, The Right Time, Tell Me Why, and One Kind of Love. One Kind of Love very well might be my favorite Brian Wilson song. I think that is one of the most beautiful songs he's ever written, and he sounds so alive in the song, and just knowing the struggles that he's been through throughout his life, and hearing him write a song like this on the other side of what was a very dark period at one point, just overwhelms me with feelings of joy and gratitude for where Brian is at this point in his life. And to me, this song, more than any of the others, really brings those feelings out of me. Another thing that I will say about this album is I think it could have actually been made a little bit better if they had taken out a few of the songs in the original track listing and substituted them with a couple of the songs in the deluxe edition, because I think Somewhere Quiet is an incredible song. I love the idea of taking Summer Means New Love and putting vocals on top of it, because that's one of my favorite Beach Boys instrumentals and definitely a deep cut for the hardcore fans. And I really love what he did with it and wished that he had included it on the original track listing. I also wish that Don't Worry and I'm Feeling Sad had also been featured on the original track listing, because I think those songs really could have made the album even better. And as you can see, most of my favorite tracks on here are the ones that Brian and Al Jardine are singing on, but a couple of the guest features that I think are nice are Guess You Had to Be There with Casey Musgraves and Our Special Love with Peter Hollins. But like I said, I do resonate more with the Brian-centered tracks as opposed to a lot of the guest features, and that is ultimately what takes away from this album a little bit for me. But I will say that of all the albums in B tier, I do think that this one is the strongest, but I just didn't feel right putting it in A tier because there are a few too many tracks that I'm not crazy about. But in the midst of that, there are still some very beautiful moments, and like I said, probably my number one favorite Brian Wilson song is on here with One Kind of Love, so that is definitely a huge thing in favor of this album in the midst of some of the flaws, but largely I would say it's a pretty good album. I will give this a B. All right, and last but not least, we have his 11th and most recent studio album from 2021 titled At My Piano. This is an instrumental album of piano renditions of 15 different Beach Boys and Brian Wilson songs, and I'm going to give this one an S. I absolutely love this album. It was such a pleasant surprise when it came out. A lot of people are sort of divided on this album because, of course, it doesn't have any new songs, and people can always take issue on that fact alone. And I've said on previous albums that I'm not always a huge fan of re-recordings of old Beach Boys songs, but with that being said, this entire album is a completely different take on these songs, where you are really hearing the stripped down versions without any vocals and hearing these very pretty arrangements where Brian is playing the chordal part on one piano track and then he does the melody on top of it, so they are two layered piano parts. And for someone like me who is a musician who's really interested in chord progressions, and someone who has done some pretty extensive research into the music of Brian Wilson, I think I am like the main sort of demographic of people that would get the most enjoyment out of this album. And also, just from a curiosity perspective, I've always wondered what Brian's piano playing is like on its own, because we don't often get to hear that. I've seen him in concert a few times before, and there have been a couple of moments where I've heard him kind of noodle on the piano a little bit in between tracks, and he would play some really cool stuff, and it's always made me wonder what he sounds like just playing piano, by himself, devoid of any singing. And we finally get that on this album, and I think the way that he did it on here was the perfect way to showcase his piano playing a little bit more. In terms of the track listing, I don't think he could have picked any better songs. He does a great job of including some of the essential early Beach Boys hits like In My Room, Don't Worry Baby, California Girls, The Warmth of the Sun, and then he gives us some stuff from Pet Sounds with God Only Knows, Wouldn't It Be Nice, You Still Believe in Me, and I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. And then there's also also a little 3.5 minute medley of some different musical pieces from the Smile album, which is also a very nice thing to throw in there. And then he also gives us a couple of tracks from the post-Smile era with songs like Friends, Surf's Up, Till I Die, and Mount Vernon Farewell, which is definitely a deep cut for the serious Beach Boys fans. I appreciate that very much as well. And of course, he includes Love and Mercy, which I think is totally fitting and works great for this piano setting. And I just love getting to hear all of these songs in these stripped down fashions. And for anybody who is not aware of my channel, I've actually done a lot of Beach Boys guitar covers that are very similar to what you hear on this album, but just with guitars as opposed to pianos. I've actually done the entire Pet Sounds album as well as dozens of other Beach Boys and Brian Wilson songs. So if you're interested in that, I will have the link in the comments and the description, so be sure to check that out. And yeah, I think this album does a great job in terms of the songs of including a little bit of everything to please everyone. You've got the early hits, you've got some Pet Sounds tracks, a Smile medley, and a couple of deep cuts and later 60s and early 70s Beach Boys songs. And I honestly don't think he could have picked better songs for this. So I could see why this album might not be for everybody, but for someone like me, I absolutely love it for what it is, and I get immense enjoyment out of hearing these songs played in this fashion. So an amazing album and a very pleasant surprise in 2021. This one gets an S. All right, we did it. We went through all of his albums, and these were the scores that I came up with. I didn't realize it until after making this video, but there are really only 6 albums of his discography to really consist of new original material. If you take out the compilation album as well as the soundtrack for I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, the Christmas album, the Gershwin album, the Disney album, At My Piano, and Smile, if you really want to be technical, just with the fact that Smile wasn't new music that was written at the time of its release, he really only gave us 6 albums of original material, which would be the self-titled, Sweet Insanity, Imagination, Getting In Over My Head, That Lucky Old Sun, and No Peer Pressure. So I was actually surprised to find that out. But I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad thing. It was just an interesting fact that I hadn't really thought of prior to making this video. But regardless of that, obviously some of the tribute and cover albums are still great, like the Gershwin album, Smile, and At My Piano. But regardless of that, it is a very enjoyable discography to go through with all sorts of twists and turns, and Brian Wilson will forever be one of my all-time favorite songwriters whose influence and contributions to the world of pop music cannot be overstated. And while I do like the Beach Boys discography more, I still think there are a lot of gems throughout this 13-album discography and are well worth exploring for anybody who is a hardcore Beach Boys or Brian Wilson fan. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it was enjoyable. And if you are interested, please feel free to check out some of my other tier lists, which will be linked in the comments and the description. I'm sure there will be other ones that you would like. And like I said, please let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree and how you would rank these albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. All right, that's it for today. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you at the next video. Take care.